You're terminated for financial misconduct. Those 6 words hit me at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday during a company-wide video call. Owen Parker, our newly promoted HR director, delivered the news with visible satisfaction as 43 colleagues looked on in stunned silence. I'm Tessa Whitman, Senior Quality Assurance Coordinator at Cascade Industries, a role that put me at the heart of ensuring FAA compliance for aerospace components where failure wasn't an option. My job required frequent travel across the Southwest to audit suppliers, document processes, and verify safety-critical manufacturing standards. Every expense, flights, hotels, meals, shipping, was meticulously recorded, cross-referenced, and backed up. My reports were airtight because lives depended on the systems I oversaw. But Owen didn't care about precision. He cared about making a name for himself. Promoted just 3 weeks earlier through connections, not competence, he launched a cost-cutting campaign targeting anything he didn't understand. When he found my $1,847.63 expense report from a recent supplier audit in Prescott, extended by 1 day to fix a corrosion risk in aircraft brackets, he saw waste. In reality, every dollar was a federally mandated compliance cost. On that call, he highlighted each line item like evidence of scandal: the extra hotel night, the $200 rush shipping fee, meal expenses slightly over per diem. He cited lack of approval signatures and declared a pattern of fraud. Without warning, I was fired, access revoked, systems locked, accused of misconduct in front of my entire team. How many characters are there and what are their names, and how many companies are there and their names as well? What Owen didn't know, that trip wasn't optional. It was part of our legally required Part 21 FAA oversight program. The documentation he questioned was federal record. By firing me, an FAA credentialed inspector, for submitting it, he hadn't just wronged me. He'd created a compliance gap that threatened the company's entire manufacturing certification. I didn't panic. I closed my laptop, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and pulled up the contact info for the law firm that had been courting me for months. Then I opened my files and found the document that would unravel Owen's entire case. The FAA Form 8130-3, signed by Federal Inspector Raymond Kolsky, time-stamped at 4:47 p.m. on the 3rd day of my Prescott visit, the unauthorized day he'd used against me. That form wasn't just proof it was legitimate. It confirmed every expense: extra hotel night, expedited shipping, extended meals, was federally mandated. By firing me over it, Owen had created a compliance gap that threatened our entire FAA certification. I attached it to an email, added 3 supporting documents, and sent it to legal, the VP of Operations, our FAA liaison, and Owen himself. Subject line: Termination, Federal Compliance Documentation, attached body. Good morning. Please find attached the FAA authorized release documentation for the supplier audit in Prescott. This is part of our Part 21 continuous oversight program under 14 CFR Section 21.139. All expenses represent required federal compliance activities. Failure to complete this audit risks immediate suspension of our production approval certificate. I trust this clarifies any confusion. Best regards, Tessa Whitman, FAA Designated Quality Inspector, Certificate #QI 7834AZ. Then I hit send and waited. At 10:23 a.m., 36 minutes later, the first domino fell. Legal's junior paralegal sent a company-wide alert: urgent compliance documentation review required. All department heads, confirm status of ongoing FAA compliance activities. Potential gap in Part 21 program. Mandatory call at 11 a.m. Chaos followed. At 10:31, General Counsel Diane Rothstein called my personal phone, voice tight. Tessa, I just reviewed your docs. We need to talk immediately. I deleted the message and poured another coffee. Owen called next, first my dead work line, then my cell. I let it go to voicemail. His tone was shaky. There might have been some confusion. I'd like to discuss the documentation. Call me back when you can. He sounded like a man realizing he'd stepped on a landmine. At 11 a.m. the leadership call began. I wasn't invited, but engineering friends live texted the fallout. Diane read from my evidence. The Prescott audit was federally mandated. The extension was required. The expenses were legally obligated. And now we have no credentialed inspector to file the final report. Silence. Then, so all those fraudulent expenses, they were required? Legally mandated, she said. And without Tessa, the audit is incomplete. Another pause. What happens if it stays incomplete? The FAA reviews us in 3 weeks. If they find a gap, they place our production approval certificate on hold. No manufacturing. No shipments. Everything stops. The room erupted. Texts flooded in. What other audits are affected? Can we hire someone else? Can we switch suppliers? Answers, all of them. No. Not without triggering a full FAA review. Months long and far costlier than my salary. By 12:17 p.m., Owen emailed leadership. After reviewing new information, there may have been miscommunication. Recommend discussing a path forward with Ms. Whitman. A perfect corporate backtrack. Diane replied 12 minutes later. Rescinding the termination exposes us to liability. Her credentials are personal. She has no obligation to help unless formally engaged. Do not contact her directly. All communication goes through legal. I savored every word. But the real chaos was just beginning. At 1:33 p.m., Owen received the FAA's automated email. Q2 Compliance Review Cascade Industries, scheduled April 3rd. With just 19 days until inspectors arrived and full access to compliance inboxes now under his control, he saw it immediately. His panic was instant. He forwarded it to General Counsel Diane Rothstein with one word: help. Diane's reply, copied to the CEO, CFO, and VP of Operations, laid out the disaster. Tessa, their only FAA-credentialed inspector, had been fired over expenses that were legally required. Now they faced a compliance gap that could suspend their entire production license. 3 options remained, none good. Hire a new inspector, 4 to 6 weeks minimum, request a delay which would raise red flags, or bring Tessa back as a consultant, at significant cost and with liability for her wrongful termination. The blame was clear. And it landed squarely on Owen. By 2:15 p.m. CO Caleb Harrison called personally. I let it go to voicemail. He cited a misunderstanding and asked to talk. I texted back, any discussion must go through my legal counsel. That leverage changed everything. At 3 p.m. I called Ashford & Associates, a firm that had long recruited me. Elizabeth Ashford answered, already hearing rumors. I explained the situation. Wrongful termination, federal compliance at risk, an incompetent HR director who didn't understand my role. Her response: I'm making you an offer. Full partner track, sign-on bonus, and we'll handle your legal case pro bono. You're going to lead the consulting proposal we send to your former employer. I said yes before she finished. By 4:30 p.m. I'd signed the offer, received the bonus, and reviewed the proposal. $85,000 for 3 weeks of work. More than my annual salary, to fix a crisis caused by their own mistake. Non-negotiable terms included a public retraction and apology. Diane responded late that evening, desperate. Could I start immediately? Elizabeth replied from dinner. Terms are non-negotiable. Proposal expires in 48 hours. Rates increase after that. We clinked glasses. You're evil, I said. I'm expensive, she corrected. They're about to learn the difference. The next morning my phone blew up. Missed calls, texts, emails from Cascade employees breaking protocol to reach me. Apologies. Please for help. Even offers to grab coffee. I ignored them all. Let them feel the weight of what they'd done. I ignored all of them and went for a run instead. Let them sweat. By the time I got back, showered, and checked my email again, there was a new message from Diane, this one sent to Elizabeth at 8:47 a.m. Elizabeth, executive team has reviewed the proposal. We're prepared to accept terms with one modification. The public apology will be issued by CO rather than HR to ensure appropriate level of accountability. All other terms accepted as written. We need to execute paperwork today and have Ms. Whitman begin work tomorrow morning. Our CFO will contact you regarding contract execution and initial payment transfer. Please confirm acceptance. Dang. Elizabeth forwarded it to me with a note. Your call. They're over a barrel and they know it. Want to push for more. I thought about it. Thought about Owen's smug face when he'd fired me. Thought about the public humiliation, the casual cruelty of doing it in front of 43 people without bothering to verify his accusations. Thought about how many other people he'd probably hurt with his incompetence and wouldn't face consequences for unless someone pushed back. Then I sent Elizabeth my response. Accept the terms. But I want the video recording of the apology sent to me directly, and I want Owen Parker present in the room when it's delivered. Non-negotiable. Elizabeth sent back a thumbs-up emoji and a single word, savage. The contract was executed by 2 p.m. that afternoon. Wire transfer for the initial payment hit Ashford and Associates account by 3:30. And at 4 p.m., I received a calendar invitation for a video conference scheduled for the next morning at 9 a.m., titled Formal Company Statement All Staff. The description simply read, Mandatory Attendance. CO address regarding recent personnel matter. I accepted the invitation and spent the rest of the evening preparing for the FAA documentation work I'd be starting. Not because I needed to, I could do this work in my sleep, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that when I walked back into that company's systems, even as an outside consultant, I would deliver flawless work that no one could ever question. Owen had tried to destroy my reputation over expenses he didn't understand. I was going to rebuild it with work so precise and thorough that his incompetence would be thrown into even sharper relief. The next morning I logged into the video conference at 8:58 a.m. The little waiting room screen showed 47 participants already connected, up from the 43 who'd witnessed my termination. Apparently word had spread and people wanted to see what happened next. At exactly 9 a.m., the waiting room dissolved and Caleb Harrison's face appeared on screen, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 2 days. He was in his office, the company logo visible on the wall behind him, wearing a suit instead of his usual business casual attire. This was an official statement and he was dressed for it. And there, visible in a chair slightly to the left of frame, sitting with his hands folded and his face carefully neutral, was Owen Parker. He looked like someone had told him to sit still, be quiet and contemplate his life choices. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the demeanor of a kid who'd been sent to the principal's office and was waiting to hear his sentence. Caleb cleared his throat and began reading from a prepared statement. You could tell it was written by legal, every word carefully chosen to minimize liability while still delivering the necessary message. Good morning, everyone. I'm calling this meeting to address the personnel matter that occurred 2 days ago regarding Tessa Whitman's employment termination. After a thorough review of the circumstances and documentation, I need to make several things clear. He paused, glanced down at his notes, then looked directly into the camera. First, the allegations of expense fraud made against Tessa were incorrect. The expenses in question were not only legitimate but federally required as part of our FAA compliance obligations. Every item that was questioned represented mandatory activity under our Part 21 certification program. These are activities that we are legally obligated to perform and document. Another pause. Owen's face remained neutral, but I could see his jaw tighten. Second, the decision to terminate Tessa's employment was made without proper review of the documentation supporting her expenses and without consultation with legal or operations regarding the nature of her work. This was a significant procedural failure that should not have occurred. Caleb shifted in his chair and his voice took on a slightly harder edge. Third, the manner of the termination, conducted publicly without prior investigation or opportunity for explanation, was inappropriate and contrary to company policy. Regardless of the allegations, every employee deserves to have personnel matters handled with dignity and privacy. Now came the part I'd been waiting for. On behalf of Cascade Industries, I want to formally apologize to Tessa Whitman for the wrongful termination, the public nature of the accusation, and the damage this has caused to her professional reputation. Tessa is a highly skilled quality assurance professional with an exemplary record of service. Her work has been instrumental in maintaining our FAA certification and ensuring the safety of the components we manufacture. She deserved better than what happened. Caleb looked directly into the camera, and for a moment, I thought I saw genuine regret in his expression. I also want to acknowledge that Tessa has graciously agreed to continue supporting our compliance program on a consulting basis through Ashford and Associates to ensure we meet our upcoming FAA review requirements. We're grateful for her professionalism in the face of this situation. Then he turned slightly, bringing Owen fully into frame. Finally, I want to address the procedural failures that led to this situation. Effective immediately, All termination decisions involving compliance, quality, engineering, or any role with federal regulatory oversight must be reviewed by legal and operations before execution. No exceptions. This policy will be formalized and distributed by end of week. He didn't explicitly say because Owen screwed up, but everyone watching knew exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Owen's face had gone pale, and he was staring at something off-camera with the expression of a man watching his career prospects circle the drain. Caleb concluded the meeting with a few words about maintaining focus and professionalism, then ended the call. Within seconds, my personal phone lit up with messages from former colleagues, almost all of them variations on, "Holy shit, that was amazing," and "Owen looked like he wanted to die." But the best message came from someone in HR, a coordinator named Melissa who'd always been friendly but never particularly close. Her text was succinct and devastating. "Owen's been put on administrative leave, effective today. Word is they're negotiating his exit package. Guess who's helping process his severance paperwork? Me. Karma is real." I sat back in my chair, coffee in hand, and let that sink in. In less than 48 hours, Owen Parker had gone from smug HR director making an example of an employee he didn't understand to unemployed administrator whose incompetence had cost his company $85,000 and counting. But I wasn't done yet. I still had work to do. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked from Ashford and Associates offices, remotely accessing Cascade's systems under my new consulting credentials to complete the outstanding compliance documentation. The Prescott audit materials, the ones Owen had flagged as fraud, were filed with meticulous detail, every timestamp verified, every signature authenticated, every cross-reference checked twice. But I also did something else. I reviewed every single supplier audit I'd conducted over the past 2 years, cross-referencing them against expense reports, and documenting the federal requirements that supported each line item. Then I compiled it into a comprehensive report titled Part 21 Compliance Program Overview, Cost Analysis and Regulatory Requirements. The report was 47 pages of excruciating detail, breaking down exactly what my job involved, why each trip was necessary, how the expenses were determined, and what would happen if those activities were skipped or delayed. It included references to specific FAA regulations, case studies of companies that had lost their certifications due to compliance gaps, and a cost-benefit analysis showing that my annual salary and travel expenses represented approximately 0.003% of the company's revenue but protected 100% of their manufacturing capability. I submitted the report as part of my consulting deliverables, along with a recommendation that Cascade implement a mandatory training program for all HR and finance personnel to understand federal compliance roles before questioning expenses related to regulatory activities. Elizabeth loved it. "This isn't just documentation," she said when she reviewed it. "This is a reference manual for every quality professional who's ever been second-guessed by someone who doesn't understand their job. Can I use this as a template for other clients?" "Be my guest," I told her. "Consider it my contribution to preventing future Owens from wreaking havoc." The FAA review took place as scheduled on April 3rd. I wasn't there in person. I was officially no longer a Cascade employee, but I was on standby via video conference in case the inspectors had questions about the documentation I'd filed. They didn't need me. The audit went flawlessly. Every document was in order, every signature verified, every compliance checkpoint marked complete. The lead inspector, Raymond Kowalski, the same one who'd signed off on the Prescott audit, even commented to Diane that the documentation quality had improved significantly from previous quarters. Diane, to her credit, made sure that comment got back to me along with a personal note. "Thank you for saving us. I mean that sincerely." I appreciated the sentiment, but I appreciated the $85,000 consulting fee more. The fallout from Owen's termination continued to spread like ripples from a boulder dropped in a pond. Within a week of his administrative leave, 3 other employees came forward with complaints about his management style. Apparently, I wasn't the only person he'd targeted, just the only one whose termination had blown up in his face so spectacularly. There was the IT specialist he'd written up for excessive software expenses that turned out to be mandatory security updates. The accountant he'd questioned about travel to a client site that was contractually required for quarterly reviews. The engineer he'd accused of padding timesheets who was actually working overtime to meet a critical FAA deadline. Every single case followed the same pattern. Owen saw an expense or activity he didn't understand, assumed it was waste or fraud, and went on the attack without bothering to verify the facts. He'd just been unlucky enough that I was the one with federal credentials and documentation that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. HR launched an internal review of all his decisions during his 3-week tenure as director. The results, according to my sources who couldn't resist keeping me updated, were damning. Of the 17 compliance issues he'd flagged, 14 turned out to be legitimate business expenses that he'd misunderstood. 2 were actually duplicates of the same expense logged in different systems. And one, mine, had nearly destroyed the company's ability to operate. His severance package, when it was finally negotiated, included a non-disparagement clause that worked both ways, meaning he couldn't badmouth the company and they couldn't provide negative references. But in the tight-knit world of aerospace manufacturing, word spreads fast. Everyone knew what had happened and everyone knew why. The last I heard, Owen was working for a small logistics company in another state, well away from anything involving federal regulations or compliance oversight. His LinkedIn profile no longer listed his time at Cascade Industries. Just a gap in his employment history that any HR professional worth their salt would recognize as code for, something went very wrong here. Meanwhile, my career took a sharp upward trajectory. Elizabeth made good on the partner track promise, and within 6 months, I was leading Ashford and Associates' aviation compliance practice. My reputation in the industry, instead of being destroyed by Owen's fraud accusations, was actually enhanced by the story of how I'd navigated the wrongful termination and come out ahead. People wanted to work with someone who had documentation so airtight that even a public accusation of fraud couldn't make it stick. Someone who understood federal regulations well enough to let her wrongful termination become the rope her accusers hanged themselves with. Someone who'd turned a career-ending moment into a 6-figure consulting contract. I started getting speaking invitations to industry conferences. Compliance documentation best practices. Navigating wrongful termination in regulated industries. When HR doesn't understand your job, a case study. I didn't name Cascade or Owen directly in these talks, didn't need to, but everyone in the audience knew exactly what story I was telling. The most satisfying moment came about 4 months after my termination, at an aerospace manufacturing conference in Denver. I was presenting a session on federal compliance documentation when I noticed a familiar face in the back of the room. Caleb Harrison, Cascade CEO, sitting quietly and taking notes. After the session, he approached me during the networking break. "Tessa, that was an excellent presentation. Really comprehensive." "Thank you," I said, keeping my tone professional but not warm. He hesitated, then said what he'd probably come to say. "I wanted you to know that we've implemented every recommendation from your report. Mandatory compliance training for HR and finance, new approval processes for any termination involving regulatory roles, and we hired a new quality director with FAA credentials to replace you. Someone who reports directly to me now, not through HR." "That sounds like a good system," I acknowledged. "It is. But it's not as good as having you. We made a mistake, Tessa. I made a mistake by not being more involved in personnel decisions for critical roles. I let Owen operate without oversight because I trusted his judgment, and that trust was misplaced. It was probably the closest thing to a genuine apology I was going to get beyond the scripted statement he'd read on that video call. And you know what? It wasn't enough. Not to make me want to go back, not to erase the memory of being publicly accused of fraud, not to undo the damage to my reputation that had taken months to rebuild. But it was enough to be civil. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "And I'm glad the company learned from the experience. That's really the best outcome for everyone." Caleb nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't going to tear into him in front of a room full of industry professionals. "If you ever want to come back in any capacity, the door is open. I mean that." "I'll keep that in mind," I lied politely, knowing I'd never set foot in Cascade Industries again except maybe as an expensive consultant billing $400 an hour. We shook hands and he moved on, and I turned my attention back to the conference, where several other companies were waiting to talk to me about potential consulting engagements. The story of what happened at Cascade became something of a legend in aerospace compliance circles. Not because it was unique, wrong terminations happen all the time, but because of how completely and publicly it had backfired. Owen had tried to make an example of me, and instead became the cautionary tale everyone told about what happens when you don't understand the roles you're supposed to be managing. There's a particular satisfaction in watching someone's attempt to destroy you become the foundation for your success. Every consulting contract I signed, every speaking engagement I accepted, every new client who reached out because they'd heard about that quality inspector who got wrongfully fired and made them pay, was a reminder that Owen's incompetence had actually done me a favor. He'd freed me from a company where federal compliance was undervalued and misunderstood, where HR directors could get promoted based on connections rather than competence, where someone could work for years doing critical, legally mandated work and still be accused of fraud because a middle manager wanted to make his mark. At Ashford and Associates, I was surrounded by people who understood exactly what I did and why it mattered. My expertise was valued, my judgment was trusted, and when I submitted expense reports for supplier audits, nobody questioned whether the trip was necessary. They just processed the reimbursement and thanked me for the thorough documentation. The final chapter of this story came almost a year after my termination, when I received an unexpected LinkedIn message from Owen Parker himself. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was long, rambling, and reeked of someone who'd spent a lot of time in therapy or career counseling trying to process what had happened. Tessa, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you delete this without reading. But I wanted to reach out and apologize for what happened last year. I made a terrible decision based on incomplete information and ego. I was trying to prove myself in a new role and I chose the wrong way to do it. I didn't take the time to understand your job or verify the documentation before jumping to conclusions. That was wrong, and it hurt you professionally and personally in ways I didn't intend but should have foreseen. I've spent the past year trying to learn from that mistake and become a better HR professional. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize what I did was wrong and I'm sorry. I hope you're doing well. I read it twice, trying to gauge whether it was genuine or just an attempt to rehabilitate his reputation. In the end, I decided it didn't really matter. The apology, whether sincere or strategic, didn't change what had happened or the consequences we'd both faced. But I did respond, keeping it brief. Owen, I appreciate you reaching out. What happened was a learning experience for both of us, though obviously in very different ways. I hope you've found a role where you can apply those lessons productively. Best wishes for your continued growth. Tessa. Professional, measured, and completely free of the anger I'd felt a year ago. Because here's the thing about revenge: the best kind isn't hot and explosive. It's cold and structural. It's building a better career on the rubble of someone else's mistakes. It's turning your wrongful termination into a consulting empire. It's becoming the person everyone calls when they need to fix the kind of problem that destroyed your accuser. Owen had tried to end my career over $1,847.63 in federally mandated expenses he didn't understand. Instead, he'd handed me a story worth its weight in consulting fees, speaking engagements, and professional credibility. 2 years after the termination, I was sitting in my office at Ashford and Associates, now a full partner with my name on the door, when Elizabeth knocked and poked her head in. Got a minute? New client inquiry just came in, and I think you're going to appreciate the irony. She handed me a tablet with an email pulled up. The sender was from a company I didn't recognize, but the subject line made me smile. Request for compliance review HR process audit. The body of the email explained that the company had recently experienced personnel management challenges related to regulatory oversight roles, and wanted to hire consultants to review their HR procedures and implement better safeguards. They don't say it explicitly, Elizabeth noted, but I did some digging. Their HR director just got fired for terminating a quality engineer over documentation he didn't understand. Sound familiar? I laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from cosmic justice being served on a regular basis. How much should we quote them? I'm thinking $120,000 for a comprehensive review. We can use your Cascade case study as the template, show them exactly what happens when HR doesn't understand compliance roles, and build them a system to prevent it. Make it $150,000, I said. Include a mandatory training program for all management. They're clearly not learning fast enough on their own. Elizabeth grinned. That's why you're a partner. I'll send the proposal today. She left, and I turned back to my computer, where I was drafting a presentation for next month's Aerospace Compliance Summit. The title, The True Cost of Compliance Ignorance, How One Expense Report Changed Everything. The presentation would walk through the entire cascade situation, properly anonymized but detailed enough that anyone in the industry would recognize the story. It would break down the financial impact, the regulatory risks, the reputational damage, and most importantly, the preventable nature of the entire disaster. And it would end with a simple message. Understand the roles you manage. Verify your facts before making accusations. And never, ever fire someone for doing federally mandated work you don't comprehend. Because if you do, there's a decent chance that person will turn your mistake into their success story, and you'll become the cautionary tale they tell at conferences for years to come. I finished the presentation draft, saved it, and leaned back in my chair. Through my office window, I could see the city skyline, the mountains in the distance, and the reflection of my name on the glass door. Tessa Whitman, Partner, Aviation Compliance Practice. Owen Parker had tried to destroy that name, brand it with fraud, erase it from his company's records. Instead, he'd made it more valuable than ever. Every client who hired me, every company that implemented my recommendations, every HR director who sat through my training and promised they'd never make Owen's mistakes, they were all proof that his attempt to end my career had backfired so completely that he'd actually launched it into a trajectory I'd never imagined. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's success so thorough and visible that everyone knows exactly who failed and who thrived. It's turning your darkest professional moment into your greatest career achievement. It's making sure that when people Google your name, the first thing they see isn't the accusation but the triumph. Owen Parker taught me that lesson, though not in the way he intended. And I've been grateful for it ever since, in the way you're grateful for any experience that reveals your own strength and resilience. So here's to all the Owens out there, the incompetent managers who mistake confidence for competence, who fire first and fact-check never, who think federal regulations are suggestions and compliance expenses are fraud. Keep making those mistakes. People like me have built entire consulting practices on cleaning up your messes. And to everyone who's ever been wrongfully terminated, accused of something you didn't do, or fired by someone who didn't understand your job, document everything, know your worth, and remember that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened. Just ask Owen Parker. Oh wait, you can't because I'm too busy to take his calls. 3 years later. Epilogue. I was invited back to Cascade Industries exactly 3 years after Owen fired me. Not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as the keynote speaker for their annual Safety and Compliance Conference. The invitation came directly from Caleb Harrison, who'd managed to turn the company around after the near disaster of the Owen era. They wanted me to speak about building strong compliance cultures and the importance of understanding regulatory roles before making management decisions. The fee they offered was $25,000 for a 90-minute presentation. I accepted. Walking into that conference center, seeing the Cascade Industries banner hung above the stage, I felt a strange sense of closure. The room was packed with employees, many of whom I recognized from that infamous Zoom call 3 years earlier. Some of them approached me before the presentation, apologizing for not speaking up that day, thanking me for how I'd handled the situation, asking for career advice about their own compliance work. I saw Diane Rothstein in the front row, now promoted to VP of Legal and Compliance, a position created specifically to ensure that what happened to me never happened again. She gave me a respectful nod as I took the stage. And there, in the back corner, trying to be inconspicuous but failing miserably, was a new HR director, a woman named Rachel something or other, who'd been explicitly told during her hiring process about the Owen Parker incident and what not to do. I delivered my presentation without notes, telling the story of my termination and its aftermath with the polish and confidence of someone who'd told it dozens of times before. I explained the technical details of Part 21 compliance, broke down the financial and regulatory consequences of the mistakes that were made, and outlined the systems Cascade had implemented to prevent future issues. But I also talked about something else: grace under pressure, professional resilience, and the importance of knowing your worth even when others don't. I talked about how being wrongfully terminated had actually opened doors I didn't know existed, how it had forced me to value my expertise appropriately, and how it had led me to a career I loved more than the one I'd lost. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Several people were crying. Caleb Harrison shook my hand afterward and said, "Thank you for being generous enough to help us learn from our worst moment." Thank you for being willing to learn, I replied. As I packed up my materials and prepared to leave, I checked my phone and found a notification that the $25,000 speaking fee had been deposited into my account. I also had an email from Elizabeth with the subject line, "Just got 3 new client inquiries from people who were at your talk today. The Owen Parker story keeps on giving." I walked out of that conference center, past the Cascade Industries logo, past the parking spot that used to be mine, and climbed into my car. As I pulled out onto the highway heading back to my office where I had a team of consultants working on projects across 6 different aerospace companies, I thought about that morning 3 years ago when Owen Parker's face had filled my screen and 6 words had changed my life. "You're terminated for financial misconduct." He'd meant them as an ending. They'd been a beginning. And that, more than any apology or financial settlement or public vindication, was the sweetest revenge of all.